And thank you, Deputy Secretary Lyons. The next session offers a panel discussion from Cabinet and Kentucky Public Service Commission leaders on current and emerging issues, or the hot topics at the Energy and Environment Cabinet. Moderator for this session is Karen Wilson, Executive Advisor of the Kentucky Public Service Commission. I will now turn the screen over to Karen Wilson.
Start that over. Good morning. Thank you, Eileen. And good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Hot Topics session. We have many pressing issues facing the Public Service Commission and the agencies within the Cabinet, and we wanted to highlight a few of those today, bring them to your attention, describe briefly how the agencies are addressing some of these current challenges and also priority issues. And as Eileen noted, we have 6 distinguished Cabinet leaders and Public Service Commission leaders with us here this morning. From the Department for Environmental Protection, we have Commissioner Tony Hatton and Deputy Commissioner Amanda LeFevre. From the Public Service Commission, we have our Executive Director, Linda Bridwell. And from Natural Resources, Department for Natural Resources, we have Jim Ward. He's Director of the Division of Mine Reclamation and Enforcement. Dennis Hatfield, who is the Director of the Division of Oil and Gas. Justin Adams, he's the Director of the Division of Abandoned Mine Lands. I'm going to start with DEP and with Commissioner Hatton and Deputy Commissioner LeFevre. Commissioner Hatton, there has been a lot of attention in the media, especially recently, regarding what are called forever chemicals, PFAS, and I can try to pronounce it, and it would be per and polyfluoral substances. They're manufactured substances, often, like I said, referred to as forever chemicals, found in everything from Teflon pans, rain jackets, to dental floss. And in the environment, as I understand, they break down slowly and they tend to bioaccumulate. And so the question is, what is DEP doing? What has DEP done? And what are your plans regarding PFAS?
Well, good. Thank you, Karen. Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you all today. I think it's safe to say there is a lot of interest on the part of the media with regards to PFAS. There's also a lot of interest across the board, including federal and state legislators and certainly law firms. I'm getting a bad echo. Law firms, consultants and scientists, and federal and state regulators. PFAS compounds, as you mentioned, Karen, are very stable compounds. They're in organofluorine, which basically means it's carbon and fluorine chains. They're very resistant to heat. They're very resistant to any kind of chemical breakdown. And so once they are in the environment or in the human body, they tend to bioaccumulate and be very persistent. They're found in a lot of different manufactured products. Food packaging, they are a primary component of aqueous film forming firefighting foam, very effective in that regard. And because they are present in a lot of different products and used in a lot of different ways in terms of industrial lubricants and things such as that, they are somewhat ubiquitous in the environment. They impact a variety of environmental media, including air, surface water, and of course, soil sediment and groundwater. With regards to the PFAS kind of thing, it is an emerging contaminant. It's not that we just begun to think about it. It's been out there for a while. There are a lot of different views and opinions on what should be done with PFAS, what kind of standards should be set, what those standards should be. That's still a topic of debate that we're seeing unfolding. Currently, with regards to standards related to PFAS, at least current thought is that the primary source of exposure is ingestion. You have ingestion inhalation, dermal contact, and maybe a couple others. But at least at this current time, from early on, the primary risk exposure is thought to be through ingestion of impacted drinking water or surface water. However, a material might enter your body, food packaging such as that. At present, EPA has a 70 parts per trillion health advisory. It's not a formal promulgated MCL. It is a health advisory. Some states that have come to the conclusion they have broader and bigger issues with PFAS, particularly in groundwater and drinking water sources, have established their own MCLs. But right now, all we have in terms from the federal standpoint is a health advisory of 70 parts per trillion. Well, and the other thing to keep in mind is with the fact that PFAS is present in so many different forms and in so many different places, that there's potentially a lot of what I call secondary sources out there, such as impacted soil that might be a continuing source to groundwater. We find it in landfill leachate. We might find it in wastewater treatment sludge. So its tentacles go out really far, and because it's persistent chemically, it tends to manifest itself and propagate itself quite readily. So in what's still, for the most part, a vacuum of statutory and regulatory requirements with regards to PFAS, what the Commonwealth has been concentrating itself on for the last 2 or 3 years is we think of issues when we solve problems, when we think of sources, pathways, and exposures. There's sources of PFAS, there are pathways through which it travels, and there are potential exposures when it gets where it's going. Because there has been a lack of standards, we began by concentrating our efforts within the cabinet on the exposure end of the equation. In 2019, we did a fairly expansive investigation of drinking water facilities across the state. The first thing we had to do was figure out how we're going to afford to do the analytical work. And fortunately for us in Kentucky, we have an analytical laboratory in the cabinet, and they worked very hard to develop their equipment and their analytical techniques to do PFAS analysis for the cabinet. That came in very handy for us. So as a result of developing that capability, we did that drinking water study back in 2019 where we looked at surface water and groundwater system. For the most part, we didn't find anything that really weren't expected. We didn't see any finished drinking water system in the state. This is a relative term, depending on your view of what might be too much. And there's lots of opinions about that for sure, even in the scientific community. But we didn't see anything in Kentucky that approached the 70 parts per trillion for PFAS, P4, or total PFAS, P4. So that was in essence a little bit of good news, because we're concerned, remain to be concerned, that our citizens are drinking as high quality water as absolutely possible. We followed that up in 2020 with a surface water study. We're looking at source waters, where we went across the state in every major watershed in the state, and I think we did 40 sampling locations, and we found measurable levels of PFAS at 36 locations. Both of those reports are available online. We also continuing, and one thing we're concentrating on right now is developing our ability to do fish tissue studies, because at some point in time, the way this is going to evolve, there's likely to be drinking water standards and perhaps water quality standards. So we want to try to get ahead of the game, develop our ability to do fish tissue studies to see what the transfer might be from potential impacts at surface waters to fish and other amphibious organisms. So, and we have a basic sort of response plan to, as we become aware of particular sites or facilities that are a problem or may be a problem, we have begun to try to inform ourselves how to address this from a technical standpoint when it comes to your typical classic releases to soil and groundwater. It's very complicated. It's very persistent, and it has the ability, unfortunately, it advex at almost the same rate as groundwater. It has the ability of producing significant groundwater plumes where there is a significant source of it. So there's a lot going on with it. It's going to come fast and furious. particularly as some of these regulations and standards might start to come into place. So there's a lot to look forward to. There's going to be a lot of debate. As far as the agency is concerned, we feel like we're starting in the right place, and it's going to become, as we move on, issues of sources and pathways and how we navigate that.
Thank you, Commissioner. I know you talked about some federal guidance, but there was some activity too just in the last few days regarding EPA roadmap. Could you touch on that just a little bit?
Sure, I'd be glad to, Karen. We have regular meetings with the Region 4 states related to PFAS and PFAS issues, where the various states are able to talk about what they're doing in their particular state and lessons learned. I think EPA is gearing up as to how this is going to affect that regulatory agency, because as standards come into play, then EPA obviously will have a more clear-cut legal role in addressing PFAS issues across the country. For a while now, there's been a conversation about establishing an MCL. As I mentioned earlier, there's significant debates about what would be considered to be safe in terms of a MCL, which is basically a standard for finished drinking water. In other words, what would be considered to be a safe level of PFAS in finished drinking water. Like I said, there's currently a health advisory of 70 parts per trillion. There are those in the community that believe a safe standard would be 1 part per trillion, and everything in between. It's worth reminding ourselves that an MCL, or a drinking water standard, is not typically just a standard that's based on risk. It's a standard that's based on both risk and treatability. So when more likely, when an MCL does come out, then that's going to be a challenge for drinking water facilities across the country. The greatest success that's been seen that I'm aware of right now in terms of reducing PFAS in drinking water is carbon, but it requires a lot of carbon and the ability to regenerate that carbon fairly regularly, on a fairly regular basis. So there's where I think at some point in time when the MCL gets established, there will be a huge uptick in responsibilities that'll have to be borne by drinking water facilities, and therefore also the state regulatory agencies that oversee them. Also, there is been discussion and continues to be discussion about making PFAS a hazardous substance under the federal Superfund program. As of right now, it's not. That's very likely to happen. When that does happen, that will give EPA clear-cut federal authority on Superfund type projects or cleanups within states. I would imagine that at least early on, the EPA is going to be heavily involved or heavily involve themselves. There's nothing wrong with that. Heavily involve themselves in Superfund PFAS issues within the states once they have the authority to do that. I will tell you this, I've been in the business a while. The remediation cleanup side is sort of where I come from. PFAS is very difficult. The conceptual model for how it gets released and where it goes is going to be difficult from a technical standpoint, and time consuming and extremely expensive to address. So I think first and foremost, the drinking water piece of it, if an MCL gets established, that's going to be the first and foremost issue, and probably the most important one coming out of the gate. And then secondly, I think becomes a hazardous substance, you're going to see a lot more EP involvement. That's when you're going to start seeing pathways and sources become more clear. For those companies or entities that manage and have released PFAS, there will be a lot for them to do in the not too distant future. And then lastly, I think EPA is, and the states are sort of grappling with what to do about air emissions of PFAS. It's not real clear how to attack that piece of it. It's not real clear what risk may be in terms of inhalation. Certainly, we do know that air emissions, when they make contact with the ground, can contaminate groundwater. It's sort of insidious in that way. But if it does at some point become a hazardous air pollutant, then I think you'll see significant impacts on your air permitting programs as well. That's something that probably needs to happen so that we can get a better handle on increasing controls and emissions of PFAS in the environment. I do think this, and I'll finish up here. You know, I remember when the PCB issue first really hit the street many years ago. Early on in a process like this with an emerging contaminant, somewhat widespread, and we're trying to figure out what to do, I think we're all going to have to check our expectations a little bit. It's going to take a while to wrap our arms around this and make measurable progress, particularly on the Superfund side. So there's going to be things coming out, and for a while, it's going to be a little bit chaotic as both federal and state regulators try to adjust to the new rules, and as a regulated community has to make adjustments to it. A couple last things. I think laboratories and consultants, this will be a little bit of a business boom for them. I'm a little concerned about infrastructure in terms of lab capacity and consultants, knowledgeable consultants that are able to handle some of these really challenging technical issues. Another thing that's going to be something that's going to have to be wrestled to the ground is as we sit here right now, if someone were to go do a dig and haul, source PFAS and contaminated soil, they would have a really extremely hard time finding a disposal facility that would accept it because of its very nature. If you dispose of PFAS in a Subtitle D landfill, you can have PFAS in your leachate. Your leachate's going to go to a wastewater treatment facility, and you can follow the stream, which is obviously there. And lastly, I do want to follow up by saying, though, this we feel pretty good about where we're standing right now as a state from a finished drinking water and a source water standpoint, but there's much more work for us to do, and we will continue to stay on top of this. We've devoted significant resources to it, and we will continue to do so.
Commissioner, thank you for providing a very good overview of something that is obviously very challenging, and you ended on a little bit of a positive note with where the state is right now. So that's you were out ahead of it, and that's, you know, that's what you do very well. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to turn to Deputy Commissioner Amanda LeFevre, and I think another thing that's been a priority issue, and it's an emphasis on environmental justice. So, Deputy Commissioner, how does the agency define environmental justice, and what is the Cabinet strategy for addressing environmental justice issues?
All right, well, thank you, Karen, and good morning, everyone. I just want to say that, first of all, environmental justice has been part of what we do here at EEC for many years. Of course, if you know me and Tony, we're both of the brownfield world, so that's sort of part and parcel to that. And especially in our cleanup programs, and Justin, you may find this as well, communicating with people and getting input has always been an integral part in working with our cleanup programs. They have that flexibility built within them. They're not that permitting program that has, the time frames and things associated with that. So you have the luxury of working with communities and, spending that time to, do a lot of work with them. So, in the Brownfields program, we do public meetings for everything from talking to people from about assessments and cleanups to visioning sessions where we have, people with paper and art supplies drawing what their communities, what they want them to look like. So that type of history and that type of experience will hopefully guide us as we look at our other programs that, also have that public outreach component, but looking at it and looking for ways to make that much more robust. So hopefully when we as we go about this, we'll be looking at that history and how we can grow from that. So I will tell you, Secretary Goodman, if you listened to her address yesterday morning, you heard her mention our environmental justice framework and that we've launched that. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, it's just sort of a plan for us to evaluate what we're doing in the agency and how we can, once again, make those EJ components much more robust throughout our programs and services, whether that's in PSC or DEP or DNR. We just want to make sure that we're doing what we need to engage the community and engage all citizens in any decision making that impacts them. So in terms of how that rolls out, the first thing that we did was really identify some folks throughout the cabinet, and they're not our full complement of people who are going to be working on this, but to do some initial steps. And one of the first things, and getting back to your original question, one of the first things we did after we identified some key stakeholders was to come up with a definition for environmental justice for the cabinet. And it pretty much follows the federal definition. We use the definition, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that's, word for word, I think, the federal definition. I will say that there were a couple of, sub-definitions that sort of clarified what fair treatment and meaningful involvement were. So we did deviate a little bit on meaningful involvement in that we there's several bullet points under there, and there's one bullet point that says people have an opportunity to participate in decisions about activities that may affect their environment and or health, period. But on the end of that, we actually tagged on regardless of community demographics or social determinants of environmental health. So we wanted to make sure that we allowed us to have a broad definition there, knowing that we may not be thinking about all the scenarios that could come up within a community. So we just want to make sure that our employees have that broad definition and made that points them to think in a different direction when they're considering what they're doing and what their programs are doing and how they can involve people. So that's how we have defined environmental justice, and that is actually on our EEC website. We have a web page strictly devoted to all of our environmental justice work that we're going to be doing. Right now, it has a lot of tools and resources on it. It has our definition, but as we roll through this and as we develop things, we hope to make that a much more robust tool for anyone who's coming to work with the cabinet, looking for information and looking to engage us and us engage them. So that was our first step. From here, there's several other things that of course we need to do. And first is to raise awareness with our folks internally and externally. So our employees, we want to make sure that we provide training for all of our employees so they know the context of environmental justice and the history and all the things that surround it. And we also want to provide some of those services to the general population, and that will just be overarching, just very basic introductory type of things. But that once again creates that awareness so we can build upon that work. So we'll be developing, from that basic rudimentary, we'll be doing some much more in-depth type training, how to raise awareness and how to work with community groups and how to engage people and how to develop tools for folks. We also want to evaluate how we involve and engage the community. So looking at all of our programs, all of our decision points, what are the things that we are doing? What are the decision points where we can let people know something's going on or get some sort of feedback? So we want to, and actually this is something that we're launching within DEP next week with our management team, who will then, it'll then cascade down to everyone. We want everyone to look at our programs, to look at those decision points, and what are those points where we can involve people and engage the community. And then also looking at the tools that we use for that. We are science folks. We speak science. Our tools are scientific, but how do we make everything digestible for the audiences that are out there? How do we get them to those resources? Understanding that some parts of our community may not have access to those. So, we want to, look at how do we outreach people, given where they're at, given, their constraints, and really develop ways where we can do meaningful public engagement on various things, whether that's a cleanup or a grant that we're doing. So there's lots of things that will probably be evolving over the next year. I think when we meet back here again next year at this time, there'll be a lot more information that I can share with you in terms of some of the decision points that we're looking at. And I'll tell you that these are conversations we're of course having with our federal counterparts as well. So a lot of what we do will depend on what they do and what they require. So we're having lots of conversations on grants, on enforcement, on cleanups. So there's also, I think our speakers talked about the Justice 40 initiative. So there's lots of talk around funding and how we adequately support environmental justice communities. So there's lots of conversation, lots of buzz around it. But in general, I think we just want to look at all of our programs, see where it makes sense to engage and to really, once again, make everything a little bit more robust in terms of making things accessible and meeting people where they are information-wise. And I'll tell you, Allison Smith earlier, I've worked with her for years, and Smith Saturday mornings working with community members, teaching them how to use our cabinet tools online and tools that they have in the cities and things like that. So a lot of it is us reaching out and going out to where people live and engaging them and teaching them what our tools are and what everything means, and and making sure our materials are there. And so it's really exciting. I look forward to working with everybody in the cabinet. We have some great leaders in this. And I'll say, just to tag on this, diversity and inclusion is also, a big driver for our cabinet as well. So within our own staff. So, looking at those issues as well. So lots more to come. So that's just a little bit of a teaser. So I hope to have some great stuff next year when we report out again.
Thank you. It's definitely more than a definition, and you're integrating it, holistically into everything that the cabinet does. And you did mention the Public Service Commission as part of that discussion, and I know I've participated in some webinars on the PUC side of things, and it's becoming, there are a lot of tools out there too. So
yeah, there's lots of stuff that's already out there. Yeah. So it's just getting people engaged with them and understanding what they are.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. That's very good. And like you said, we'll be discussing this more next year. And so, well, speaking of the Public Service Commission, we're going to turn to our Executive Director, Linda Bridwell. We have, I think most people kind of associate the role of the PSC with aspects of utility rates and service, but maybe one of the less commonly known responsibilities of the PSC is enforcement of the pipeline safety standards and underground facility protection program, or statutes, as they relate to natural gas and hazardous liquids. Can you tell us a little more about this responsibility and why it's important, especially as it relates to energy and the environment? And thank you for being here with us too.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen. I appreciate it. Yes, it seems like on a panel of hot topics, it seems a little unusual to come back to something that's been in place since 1970, but we do need to talk a little bit about that and why it's important right now. So in 1970, the General Assembly did determined that the PSC was the agency that was going to enforce federal pipeline statutes, and safety standards. So we have a staff that does inspections on the utilities that provide it. This requires monitoring, inspection for utilities, and companies that transport natural gas. And the reason we're talking about it today is because even with all of the exciting new things that are going on in energy and sustainable energy with, you know, solar siting, that there's 28 new facilities that are going to be across the state in solar. We have net metering programs. But natural gas is going to continue to be a big role in the U.S. energy needs in the foreseeable future. And frankly, the safest and cheapest transportation for natural gas is through pipelines. So while we've got all these exciting new things coming along, I wanted to make sure that we talked about it on a hot topic. And why is it a hot topic today? Well, because earlier this year, after going probably 5 years without having a serious issue, early back in February and March, we had a series of 5 explosions across the state in a period of about 6 weeks. And they were serious explosions, significant property damage, loss of life. And they aren't making the headline news, and they may not be the things that are being talked about, but they're critical to continuing to provide our energy needs and doing it safely. So in addition to inspecting the natural gas in the pipeline, and as these pipelines increase and we're seeing more transportation, we need to make sure that the utilities are being responsible and that they're being protected. So the other piece of this, the natural extension, is the damage prevention. And you'll see the PSC is really upping their game on damage prevention. We're really looking at different ways of finding out who's responsible when there is damage, because there is such a potential for not just the property damage and the loss of life, but also interruption of our energy needs when there are things that go wrong. So we're going to continue to be talking about it. We're going to be continuing to talk to the legislatures about it as we move forward. There's some things going on with damage prevention. There were some changes last year to the legislation. There may be some additional changes. We just want to make sure that everybody's continuing as we look at all these new opportunities in energy and the environment, that we don't forget about the things that are also some of our core responsibilities. So thanks, Karen.
Thank you. And we've been incorporating more the changes into the that occurred in the 21 session into training for facility operators as well. And you may have mentioned that. I think it's a lot going on there. So thank you. We're going to move on, transition a little bit to the Department for Natural Resources. We have with us several folks who are going to talk about some of their hot topics. And I'm going to start with Jim Ward. He's the Division Director for Mine Reclamation and Enforcement. You know, we've seen a significant decline in the coal industry over the last decade, and that's resulted in a number of bankruptcies within the industry. Could you provide us an update on the current status of bankruptcies and what your division is doing to monitor those, and explain how the division addresses those bankruptcies? And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Karen. And we have approximately 30% of our inspectable permits in some stage of bankruptcy. We're still working our way through several bankruptcies. Some companies have come through with reorganization plans to continue mining and reclamation operations. We have 323 permits in the bankruptcy process out of the current 1,335 permits. Our staff has spent over 10,000 hours on bankruptcies in addition to the regular duties this year. But on a good note, with Governor Beshear's Energy, Environment, and Economics Plan, and with the leadership of Governor Beshear's, we have been able to create new jobs through reclamation work being done, putting our miners back to work, protecting our environment with the long overdue reclamation being performed. And by doing agreed orders with coal companies, so they can continue to do reclamation and produce energy. Reclamation is being achieved on a large scale. This past fiscal year, Kentucky granted 85% more Phase 3 released acres than the year before. That means these acres have successfully reclaimed, revegetated, and bonds released. We have also observed a 10% decrease in the amount of open highwall. Open highwall is one of the largest reclamation liabilities that we face. With the current uptick in the demand for coal, we're hopeful that this will stave off additional bankruptcies. In lessons learned, we are reviewing concerns of reclamation liability. Forfeiture is a last resort and is not an easy process, with the rights of the coal companies to a hearing and the appeals process. The better situation is when the cabinet and the surety companies can work together on reclamation agreements instead of forfeiture. And that's kind of an update on our bankruptcies.
So in addition to coal mining, your division is also responsible for permitting, inspection, and regulatory enforcement of all non-coal mining in the state. This includes limestone, sand, gravel, shale, clay, ore spar. What are some of the issues there that you're facing? And are there some similar challenges to what you're seeing in the coal industry? Can you explain a little bit?
The non-coal industry is vastly different from the coal industry. However, it is changing. Over the last 2 years, we have had an increase in the number of permitting actions across the state, and we have realized the need for increased inspection and staff. With the proposed infrastructure bill, we see this program expanding, given the increased extraction of limestone and other non-coal materials for roads and construction. And with increased public involvement with the industry, we'll work with companies to address these concerns and find resolutions going forward. We currently have 243 permits across the state. We have 45 permit applications and modifications submitted. Some of the biggest challenges are internal, given the limited extent of the program for a growing industry. We're updating our application submittal process to address the growing needs of the industry. Non-coal has been accepting and reviewing paper applications for decades, and it's time for an update. We're working toward electronic permitting similar to the Division mine permits for the coal application. We recently received our first electronic application submitted as a test run. More work will need to be done before full implementation. We are conducting joint site visits with permitting review staff, inspectors, and engineering staff. We are developing a checklist matching our regulations to each item in the permit application as a reference document. We're also developing an instruction manual providing information on what needs to be in the application for a given site. The non-coal industry is getting much more attention from environmental attorneys and the public in general. We're seeing more protests with applications when they are advertised. Therefore, we need to be receiving more complete, accurate applications. This manual will address both administrative and technical requirements. We are hopeful that will improve guidance, will lead to improved permit applications, which in turn will address many of the concerns brought up in the permit protest.
Thank you for that overview. I'm not sure everybody is as aware of the non-coal side of what you do, so that was a good description and a good overview. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to move into the oil and gas world now. We have Dennis Hatfield. He's the division director for the Division of Oil and Gas. So thank you for being here. There has been a lot of discussion lately about abandoned or orphan, that sometimes the term used, oil and gas wells. This is something that's occurring not just in Kentucky, but nationally. So why is this such a hot topic? And why do we have orphan or abandoned wells? Can you give a little bit of background, and then also, you know, some activities, some things that your division is doing to address this?
Yes, thank you, Karen. This has been a hot topic. It's a high-profile issue at state and federal levels, and it's an issue our division deals with every single day. Simply put, an orphan well is an abandoned well that has no responsible party remaining. There's nobody left to plug it except the state. All oil and gas producing states have this issue, some to a greater scale and impact than others. Most orphan wells are pre-law wells. They were drilled and abandoned long before other states, including Kentucky, developed their oil and gas laws that required permitting and mapping and bonding. Now, the orphan count can also grow even in modern day if an operator fails and forfeits his bond, but the great majority of orphan wells are pre-law issues. Taking Kentucky oil and gas history as an example, the first oil discovery in Kentucky was in 1818 in McCreary County. They were looking for salt and found oil and messed everything up. But the first oil drilling boom actually happened in the 1860s after the Civil War. So Kentucky's primary oil and gas laws that established this division, that came along in the Oil and Gas Conservation Act of 1960. So we effectively started 100 years behind on day one. We have been catching up ever since. And this is a hot issue because orphan wells represent a substantial environmental legacy liability. They're found in crop fields, in backyards, residential developments, forest lands, surface waters, and even in tourism areas. Their impacts, they can affect the air quality, soil, groundwater, surface streams if they're not addressed. Now, some orphan wells are just a nuisance. They're there and maybe they're in the way, but they don't affect anything. But others, if actively leaking, can be hazardous. I will also note that oil and gas facilities are part of this liability problem. It's not just a well, sometimes there's also a tank or a line with it that presents an expansion of that liability, but it's a hot issue and something everyone's looking at.
There has been some discussion, I think we've touched on a little bit about, you know, infrastructure funding, and if that were to come through, you know, that would be helpful to your program, correct? You would be able, there's something in those provisions for plugging and for addressing abandoned wells.
Yes, there is. And of course, Kentucky's not alone in this orphan well problem. When you look at Kentucky's count, there is a national survey that's out there. Kentucky shows about 14,000 documented orphan wells out there. That sounds like a lot. And there's a survey out there by the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission that compares our state to other states. Documented orphan well simply means that we know that it existed, a location was mapped, and we know that it's unplugged. There is another category of undocumented that it's a speculative thing. You have pieces of information, you have probabilities, and so you put those numbers together and they represent your total orphan well count. In Kentucky's case, if you just count documented, we rank just behind Oklahoma. They have a higher number. But if you rank everybody else, if you add in the unknowns, New York, Oklahoma, Ohio, Pennsylvania, all of these states have more problem wells than we do. Their counts are in the hundreds of thousands. So while Kentucky has a significant orphan well issue, other states have some bigger problems. Now, the upside is that Kentucky has been working on this for a while. We've in our history since about 1984, the state has had an active program through the statutes to plug orphan wells, and we've plugged over 4,100 wells in our brief history. So, you know, we're working toward resolution of this problem, but the numbers are bigger than our resources. So we are absolutely excited about the thought of getting some federal help. It's needed. These orphan wells, they show up and we deal with them on a priority basis, but they're a problem. They're a problem in neighborhoods. They're a problem in development. We plugged one not long ago in a state park. You know, we encounter these kind of issues and we deal with them as we can. We are excited about the thought of some federal involvement that would present some funding that would help Kentucky address this orphan well issue.
Thank you so much. And you two ended on a positive note, recognizing that the agency's been proactive and has been doing what you can with the resources, and infrastructure funding would be a big help. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen.
So our last panelist, before we circle back, if we have a chance to circle back for further discussion, is Justin Adams, Director of the Division of Abandoned Mine Lands. And good morning.
Good morning.
Thank
How are you, Karen?
You rely primarily on federal funding, it's my understanding. In the past year, funds granted to the division through the federal OSMRE to the AML and the AML pilot programs, you've seen a decrease in that funding. So how are you dealing with the reduction in funding, and how does that affect your day-to-day operations?
Thanks, Karen. That's a great question. I guess before I get into that, I'd just like to thank everyone for inviting me here to talk today. You know, there's not enough money. In the decades-long history of this program, there's never been enough money. There are hundreds of millions of dollars of outstanding AML hazards documented across the state. And like Dennis was saying, there's an undocumented count as well. Our division relies on citizens to report when they discover hazards associated with historic mining. And so we know, while we know that we have a documented, you know, history of several hundred million, $696 million worth of outstanding concerns, the citizens would probably, if they could tell us everything, if we could see every one of them, it'd be a huge, much larger number. And so there's just not enough money. And that's something that we've dealt with all along. We have to triage situations as they come to the division and deal with the most hazardous first in a way that makes sense. When I was chosen to be director of this agency back in April of 2021, we found out just a few months before that between the AMLER program and the AML program, we were going to lose about $18 million in funding for this year. That funding loss is a byproduct of the decline of coal production and federal calculations for the funding allotment. As you can imagine, that's had a huge impact on the way that we do business daily. When we got to looking at those final tallies and started looking at projections for this coming year, I knew we were going to have to take some drastic measures to preserve the spirit of the mission of the division. So we had an in-depth dialogue internally. Staff talked about targeted areas that they felt like we could do things and take efforts to make potential savings. Steps like value engineering, our design branch manager, Bob Jones, likes to refer to it as that, where his staff look at their design plans and focus on utilizing techniques that are the most cost effective, but also site appropriate. To our daily inspections, where field staff worked diligently to ensure that they had identified potential cost savings and that they were making sure that contracts were absolutely only making minimal changes if necessary. And then, of course, we utilize technology to facilitate remote interaction. We've saved on energy costs. We've assessed our previous workflows and identified ways to reduce the time that we had dedicated to tasks. All those efforts were relatively successful. And we've been able to roll those realized savings back into the program and really directly into additional work around the homes of citizens in the Commonwealth. Ultimately, we've scaled back the size of projects. We've opted instead to focus on helping as many citizens with abatement as we could and only cleaning up the most serious of hazards. And of course, as a part of that, we have had staff over the last few months, if they've left for greener pastures or retired, we've not been able to replace those individuals. And so with the pressure of the budget crunch that we have, I've had to ask our staff to take on work in stricter conditions, a little more work, and they've really responded. I'm super proud of those individuals out there, and I guess I've got to kind of take a moment to say that. I think our staff has taken a personal interest in making sure that they contributed to the effort of saving funds for the division. I know they have, because they've called me, they've messaged me, they've emailed me with great ideas or with examples of places where they took steps to just save a few $100s here or there in a contract, and it's made a big difference. I would say that anyone that's listening really right now, if they have an AML project around their residence that started recently or is projected to start soon, those projects are only happening because of the efforts of our AML staff in Frankfurt and Madisonville, London, Prestonsburg, and Hazard. It's their hard work and their dedicated effort of those individuals that made additional reclamation projects possible this year by saving those funds where we could. So we've been dealing with it as best we can, Karen.
I'm sure they appreciate that you gave them the recognition for their hard work and dedication. Thank you for that. You did mention the AMLER, or it's the pilot program, right. ML pilot. It has a new name, and maybe people don't know what that new name is. And could you just describe a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about the AMLER program and the difference between AMLER and AML. So the AMLER program is formerly known as the AML pilot program. That program, which has been underway since like 2016, has awarded about $130 million in grant projects aimed to encourage economic growth and revitalization in the Appalachian region. There are 53 projects associated with that funding, and about 31 of those, I think, are still under development. 10 are in active construction. We've completed about 12 of them to this point. Like you were saying, there's a lot of questions always about AML funding and AMLER funding. They're two totally different grant programs. AML program focuses on the abatement of dangerous hazards associated with historic mining. The funding from AML comes from the AML Trust. It's directly related to the known historic inventory of mining in Kentucky and the volume of current mining in the state each year. The AMLER program is totally different than that, the AML Economic Revitalization Program. It's a grant program that's tied directly to the federal general fund coffers. The funds from that program can only be utilized to fund community-sponsored grant proposals that create economic development in mining communities in eastern Kentucky. It's often confusing and sometimes frustrating for citizens and public servants when our division says, hey, we're low on funding and we don't know when we can get to that AML hazard. But then they see on the news that the AML has released an AMLER grant for several $1 million for a building or a park near them. But the problem is, of course, the AML administers both of those programs, but we unfortunately can't cross-pollinate the funding. As far as the AMLER program is concerned, there's been some great measure of success, especially over the last year. Just to mention a few, the ECAMI project in Johnson County has been training out-of-work miners for a career in CNC machining. The Prestonsburg Passage in Floyd County, which is a Rails to Trails project, drawn in thousands of visitors. It's been very successful. The Dashport project in Perry County is employing Eastern Kentuckians in their aluminum fabrication plant there. And those are just kind of a few examples of the successful projects associated with AMLER that are currently underway. There are actually dozens of other projects in a variety of phases of development that will soon enrich their local economies, provide jobs, training, or tourism opportunities for the region in itself. It's not been an easy task, really. Aside from the typical changes you might expect with any federal grant program, there have been also numerous impacts associated with the global pandemic, and those have been pretty significant. I think grantees have seen the cost of their equipment rise significantly. Building material, of course, skilled labor is hard to find right now. All of that eats into the scope of their project when they have to pay a little bit more for a 2x4. That's a little bit less they can do at the end of the work that they're doing. So also some of the items and equipment that they've needed have been hard to find, or maybe just aren't even available at all because of manufacturing restrictions. And the same's kind of true for interested contractors. Many times projects simply don't receive the sort of interest they expect from potential bidders If they do have bids, there are very few of them in some cases, and that means those bids are typically higher. A lot of that, I believe, is because there are so many projects underway across the state and the nation, but also that the number of qualified contractors is kind of restricted due to the pandemic. But despite those challenges, and thanks to the willpower really of the motivated individuals that are kind of at the core of each of these projects, the grantees themselves, just have so many great people associated with the projects. Those grants continue to move along. They adjust for their scope and their expectations, but they also utilize unique and out-of-the-box approaches to address the roadblocks along the way. So AML, of course, is always happy to participate in these AMLER projects, happy to administer them and be a partner with these just dedicated and wonderful individuals in their communities looking to do something good for the people of the region. And so it's been a challenge, no doubt about it, and it's been a little bit slower than anybody would have liked, but we've had some good success with them.
Thank you for the overview and for highlighting some of the successful projects, and hopefully some of those supply and other issues related to the pandemic will start to ease maybe as we enter into 2022. I know it's affecting everybody really in some form or fashion. I have one question for all of you really, and a couple of you touched on it, some regarding staffing. I think every agency is affected by staffing, not just related to the budget, but a lot of turnover, people retiring, loss of talent. So like other agents, we see that in the private sector, we see it in government. What are you all doing in terms of planning for retirement, succession planning? I know Commissioner Hatton, you had a discussion of this topic at a chamber event, and I thought it was very interesting, and I might start with you if you could provide a little bit of an overview.
Sure, Karen, I'd be glad to. If you were to look at a cross section of, and this is probably true in many areas across state government and other states and even the federal level, if you were to look at a cross section or demographic of years of service in the agency right now, you would see that the lion's share of people that are in the agency now have been here 5 years or less, or 15 years or more. And so what's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is it's a challenge to retain new people when they come into the agency. And there's lots of reasons for that. Some of them are legitimate. People make personal decisions. They have a career path scoped out. They come work for the agency, get some experience under their belt and move on. While simultaneously on the other end, as you mentioned, Karen, other people with knowledge and experience are moving towards retirement and into the future. So while there are lots of reasons, there are challenges for sustainability and keeping folks in the agency to get them to a point to where they can be future leaders and decision makers. One of the areas in which I think we can try to make some positive impact, and we're talking about that, is sort of revitalizing, getting our face out there, job fairs and things such as that. I know that Deputy Secretary Lyons is going to be working on that pretty diligently with DEP and DNR and other agencies. But one of the things that I've always thought since I came to work at state government, I had 12 years of consulting experience prior to coming here, was one of the challenges is how do we transfer knowledge and experience to our younger staff? How do we give our younger staff a sense of purpose? Because a lot of what they do on a day-to-day basis appears to be fairly mundane. I can walk across the hall here right now and see these folks over at Tech Services and Air Quality. They're hardworking young folks. They keep their head down and they're managing a lot of data. And when they leave work at the end of the day, they may not feel as though they've done a whole lot, but it's those mundane daily activities that we do in the agency. It's actually what moves the needle and makes us successful. We have a lot of folks in the agency who have a lot of experience. They've been there and done that, and decision making, specific issues. How do we transfer that to our younger folks? Because there's some art and some abstractness to what we do as regulators. So one of the things we're looking at doing is we have a Kentucky Management Learning program we're putting together. We're going to have a series of classes, 100, 200, 300, and 500 series classes. Our 100 series classes are really going to be geared at making sure all of our staff know what we do as a whole and how important their role is in it, and also sort of informing them on some of the history of what we do and some of the more abstract things that we do here in the agency. And those experienced folks that we have, there's a lot of them that want to give up what they learned over the years, but they don't really have a venue for doing it. They're going to catch somebody in the lunchroom in the hall and say, hey, I've done this before. This is how we did it. This is how you should think about this problem. But some of these training classes that we're going to be putting together, they're going to be conversational. They're not going to be just data dumps. Are designed specifically for the purpose of giving experienced, knowledgeable staff an opportunity to venue for passing along what they've learned to some of our younger folks, which I think is critical in terms of sustainability. And then secondly, just making sure people understand what their role is and how important might in some cases motivate somebody to want to make a full-time career out of working here in the agency, which is what I hope will happen. And then there's going to be some very detailed training classes. I think we can train ourselves just as good as anybody else can train us, and we can do it at a cheaper cost. So that's one of the things that we're doing that we have control over. We are committed to it. We have resources committed to it. We're operating this out of the commissioner's office. So there'll be more to come on that, Karen.
Thank you. I think that sounds very rewarding, and giving new people a sense of purpose and fitting in, especially during this time when, you know, we've all had a lot of new staff who have not even had face-to-face with their colleagues. So to find that. Would anybody else like to weigh in and talk about your activities regarding staffing and succession planning? And if not, we can open it.
I think Linda and I are.
Well, I didn't know if Amanda wanted to jump in there first, or.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to say one more quick thing too. You know, we're very DEP focused on the this thing that we're launching, this educational process we're launching. However, another part of it is also understanding where we fit in to larger EEC umbrella and how we work with PSC and how we work with Justin's program, and you know, so those types of connections get lost too, and you know, we battle with those all the time, you know, with silos and things like that. So it's also important to maintain that overall agency perspective in those trainings too, because you know, what we do in our individual agencies impact, you know, folks down the hill, folks down the hall, folks downstairs. So also keeping that in mind as well.
And I just wanted to add on to what the commissioner, the deputy commissioner said. In the transfer of knowledge, one of the things that we're looking at the PSC, you know, we've all seen the labor issues and the shortages, and it's been particularly challenging with Kentucky and state government just because the state employees, I mean, it's been in the news a lot for the last few years, and there has really been an effort to cut down and hold salaries and change pensions, and some of the things that were attractive for employees a few years ago may not be now. So one of the things we're looking at the PSC is we are looking at adding resources. I mean, it's we've got a lot of challenging things coming down the path with these really cool different sustainable energy projects, and we've got net metering going on, which is some of the most complex utility rate work that we've been doing, and yet we're the leanest that we've probably been in 2 decades. And so we're looking at really what kind of resources can we ask the legislature for to that are reasonable, and then also embracing technology. You know, state government's never been one that's really been on the cutting edge necessarily, or the perceptions that it's not on the cutting edge, but we're trying to move into hardening our technology, streamlining processes, looking at things, what can we do smarter, what can we do better, and making sure that we have cross-training, that there's always a backup for somebody in the office, because you never know when somebody's gonna find a better job and decide to leave you with 2 weeks notice, hopefully. So, you know, those are just some of the things in addition to transferring knowledge that we're trying to do to really step up our game and work with what we've got to still deliver our message.
Karen, I think I'd probably just add to that. Of course, all those things are true, and it's so valuable to be able to transfer that knowledge base from one group to the other. But I would just say, too, Commissioner Hatton's talking about that interaction between seasoned employees and relatively new employees, and something that happens during that interaction, other than just a transfer of knowledge, is a transfer of passion. And so a lot of those older employees that have been here for a while have a passion for the work that they do. I know it was conveyed to me as I came up through the Division of Abandoned Mine Lands. The men and women that were in front of me in time, chronologically in the division, had a lot of passion for the work that we did, and for helping communities, and for helping citizens, and for solving problems, which is a lot of what AML does. And so I think that's vitally important too in those interactions.
Yeah, just to tag on, if I could, to what both Commissioner Hatton and Justin have said, there's a great need for human interaction. That's what gets people excited about growth and opportunity. And we've all suffered from COVID and what it's done to us. You know, we can't talk, we can't ride together, we can't pass information to each other. We're going to get past this, and it'll give people that opportunity to grow, because we need those kind of forums where the senior and mature people can pass along the excitement and the passion and the energy and purpose to the younger people coming along. You got to give people a vision and a growth opportunity. And if they see that, I think that'll help us retain. There's a lot of pieces of it, but you got to pass along the knowledge and the enthusiasm as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
And Karen, if you don't care, I'll add a little bit too. We do have a training program as our inspectors in the coal division comes in, and we do train them, and also our supervisor positions has anywhere from 5 to 7 employees. So they're the young ones, as they go up among the ranks, the supervisors out in the field with them a lot to teach them what they need to look for, what they need to do, and the passion that it takes to do this job. So, you know, that's the thing, the way we kind of do that. And because there's no way that we could send someone out in the field with no experience and have to do and interpret the regulations that we have to interpret. So we do have a pretty good program that way. Also, as far as our inspectors, we are on a ratio 25 to 1 from OSM. So right now, I think we are at a 24 to 1. So, you know, it's a matter of retaining, and we do have a lot of experienced people there that at some point before too long will probably start retiring. So that's the reason we're putting an emphasis on trying to train everyone up as much as we can. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you all for, you know, I think that's it's the most important thing we have is our human resources, our people, and so appreciate the overview of what you all are doing and to address, you know, staffing and also looking forward and instilling passion in the people who are new. I think that's very important. I know that's what I felt when I first came to the cabinet early on in my career, and just, you know, it resonated with me, and the people resonated with me. So, thank you all. We have a few minutes left. Do we have any questions coming in from the?
Hi, Karen. It looks like we have one question in the queue. So there's been a lot of development around solar farms, both here in Kentucky and in other states. What is the state actually doing to help citizens reap the benefits of solar development and ensure that these solar farms are developing best management practices?
Karen, would you like me to take that one?
Yeah, I would, yes.
So we debated about whether to include that as one of the topics. Right now, there are currently, as I mentioned earlier, there are 28 projects that are somewhere in the approval process. And these are projects that are in excess of 10 megawatts. So they require siting board approval, and the siting board is within the agency of the Public Service Commission. So they're looking at each one of these projects. So there's a 120-day window from the time the application is filed until an order has to be issued, either approving or denying. At this point, we have fully resolved and approved 3 of the projects. There are 12 more that are at some point in the process, and then we have about 13 that have given us the notice that they're going to file, but they haven't filed the application yet. So we are hiring experts from the outside to help us on, are the farms, the solar projects, looking at best management for operations, construction, and decommissioning. We certainly want to make sure that the systems and the projects are being held to a standard and are operating, and we're looking at what kind of bonds have to be put up to make sure that if the project developer goes bankrupt, that the site is still operational and can be decommissioned as well. So these are some of the things. If you're interested in looking at it more, that all rests within the Public Service Commission purview, and we're happy to share more information about that with the public.
Do we have any other questions out there?
I believe that's all we have for today, Karen. Thank you.
Okay, well, we're just a few minutes shy of our time to wrap up. So thank you everyone for being here. Appreciate all the comments and the overview of all these important programs and hot topics. And we'll have more hot topics next year. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.
Yes, indeed. A special thank you to Karen Wilson and to the distinguished panel of speakers this morning. We appreciate your candid discussions on these very important hot topics for Kentucky.